In the beginning, there was only heat and silence. Molten stone circled beneath a sky of ash, turning slow as breath, waiting for the first word. The planet was learning to speak, and its voice rose through rifts in the cooling crust, syllables of sulfur and steam breaking the surface like thoughts becoming sound. 4.5 billion years of listening to itself, feeling pressure build in chambers of darkness, finding release through columns of fire that painted the air with messages no one could yet understand. What if every eruption was not destruction, but declaration? The earth announcing its presence to the void, saying, "I am here, I am alive, I am still becoming." The light was amber then, diffused through clouds of ash that would settle as the first sediments of memory. Somewhere beneath the stillness, stone was composing itself. Magma moved in currents too slow for sight, carrying heat from the planet's iron core toward fractures in the lithosphere, where pressure and time conspired toward speech. Each volcano a throat, each magma chamber a lung filling with the breath of geological process, each eruption a word spoken into the atmosphere of an early world still learning the grammar of its own existence. And in those first volcanic utterances, there was oxygen released, water vapor freed, the chemical vocabulary that would eventually spell atmosphere, ocean, life itself. The planet was not silent. It had been speaking all along. The sky held that amber quality for ages, suspended between clarity and obscurity, as if the planet were deciding what kind of world it wanted to become. Everything waits. Most geologists agree that volcanic activity began within the first few 100 million years of Earth's formation, roughly 4.5 billion years ago. As the young planet cooled, its surface fractured into what would eventually become the architecture of plate tectonics, vast sections of crust floating on the viscous mantle beneath. Evidence suggests that these early volcanoes were more numerous and more active than those we observe today, erupting along the boundaries where plates pulled apart or collided, where the planet's internal heat found pathways to expression. The magma that rises through these conduits originates deep within the mantle, sometimes from depths exceeding 100 kilometers, carrying with it fragments of the Earth's interior composition, like letters written in minerals no human would read for billions of years. The process unfolds in slow increments. Magma gathers in chambers beneath the surface, its buoyancy gradually overcoming the weight of overlying rock. Pressure builds across decades or centuries, temperature and gas content shifting the equation toward release. When eruption finally comes, it arrives through a choreography of physics, dissolved gases expanding as pressure decreases, magma rising through conduits and fissures, pyroclastic material fragmenting and scattering across kilometers of landscape. Scientists believe that different types of volcanoes speak in different registers. Shield volcanoes pour out basaltic lava in fluid sheets, their eruptions relatively calm, building broad mountains through patient accumulation. Stratovolcanoes erupt more explosively, their viscous magma trapping gases until pressure shatters stone, sending plumes of ash into the stratosphere where they circle the globe for months. Some researchers propose that volcanic activity has been a primary driver of atmospheric evolution. The gases released during eruptions, water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen compounds, gradually built the protective layers that would make complex life possible. Over ages measured in hundreds of millions of years, volcanoes exhaled the oceans into being, one eruption at a time, each plume carrying moisture that would condense and fall as rain on newly cooled basalt. The planet was essentially breathing itself into habitability, using volcanic processes as the mechanism of transformation. This was not instantaneous creation, but rather accumulation, word by word, breath by breath, until enough water had been released to pool in the lowest places and begin the long work of shaping coastlines. Records preserved in ancient rock formations show periods of intense volcanic activity, coinciding with mass extinction events, climate shifts, and the emergence of new ecological conditions. The Siberian Traps eruption roughly 250 million years ago released enough volcanic material to cover an area larger than Europe, triggering temperature changes that reshaped life's trajectory on Earth. Yet these catastrophes also cleared space for new forms to emerge, new experiments in adaptation and survival. The planet spoke, and the world changed in response, not from malice, but from the simple fact of its ongoing internal processes seeking expression. The question remains, what language is this exactly? What syntax governs the timing and location of eruptions across the planet's surface? Some studies suggest patterns related to the movement of mantle plumes, columns of hot material rising from near the core mantle boundary, like thoughts ascending toward articulation. Others point to the subduction zones, where oceanic crust slides beneath continental plates, melting as it descends, its liquefied remains rising again as volcanic chains stitched along coastlines like recurring phrases in a long conversation. The distribution is not random. Volcanoes cluster along plate boundaries and hotspots, creating a geography of expression that mirrors the planet's internal architecture. Noon holds steady over green water, and beyond what the data can show, beyond the seismographs and satellite measurements and geochemical analyses, there lingers a question that science approaches but cannot quite answer. What if these eruptions are not merely mechanical events, but something closer to expression? What if the Earth, in its volcanic moments, is not just releasing pressure, but also releasing meaning, speaking in a grammar of heat and mineral and temporal rhythm that we are only beginning to learn to hear? Through long seasons of plate movement and magma differentiation, the planet has refined its vocabulary. In Iceland, where the mid-Atlantic ridge rises above sea level, volcanoes erupt along fissures that split the island like a sentence, breaking across lines of poetry. Basalt flows, writing themselves across moss-covered lava fields in characters we might interpret as persistence or renewal or simple continuation. In the Ring of Fire encircling the Pacific, where most of the world's active volcanoes cluster along subduction zones, eruptions punctuate geological time like emphatic statements about the planet's ongoing transformation, reminding us that the ground beneath our feet is temporary, still being composed, still subject to revision. Perhaps the Earth remembers its molten youth, when all of it was volcanic, when there was no distinction between interior and surface, no solid ground to stand upon. Perhaps each eruption is a kind of remembering, a return to that state of fluid becoming, a moment when the planet's current form softens back toward its original condition. Magma rising through the crust carries with it the mineral signature of deep time, elements forged in supernova explosions before the solar system existed, now cycling through Earth's interior and returning to the surface, bearing testimony to origins beyond memory. In this sense, volcanoes are not just speaking, but also recollecting. Their lava flows carrying fragments of the planet's autobiography encoded in crystal structures and isotope ratios. The ancient Greeks believed volcanoes were the forges of Hephaestus, the blacksmith god hammering out weapons and armor in chambers beneath mountains. The Hawaiians understood volcanoes as manifestations of Pele, the goddess of fire and creation, her moods determining where lava would flow and which communities would be transformed by her presence. These were not primitive misunderstandings, but rather poetic recognitions of what science would later confirm in different language, that volcanoes are indeed sites of creation, places where new land is born, where the planet's interior becomes its exterior, where heat and pressure produce transformation. The myths encoded observation, generations of watching and wondering translated into stories that made sense of forces too vast to measure with available tools. Some geologists speak of volcanic systems as having memory, a kind of structural learning where previous eruptions influence the pathways and behaviors of future ones. A volcano that has erupted explosively will often develop conduits and chamber geometries that favor explosive eruptions in the future. The mountain remembers its own violence, incorporates it into the architecture of subsequent events. This is not consciousness as we understand it, but perhaps it is something adjacent, a material record shaping material outcomes, the past constraining the future through accumulated physical fact. Meanwhile, in the stone, invisible to surface observation, magma continues its slow ascent through fracture networks and zones of weakness, following pathways established over millions of years of repetition. The mantle convects in patterns that persist across geological epochs, hot material rising beneath mid-ocean ridges and volcanic hotspots, cooler material sinking at subduction zones, the whole system circulating like breath in a body too large to comprehend as a single organism, yet behaving with a kind of coordinated rhythm, nonetheless. The convection cells move at rates measured in centimeters per year, imperceptible within human lifetimes, but powerful enough to break continents and build mountain ranges when given enough time. It was not an ending, only a pause. Consider the vocabulary available to a planet. Not words, but forces. Not grammar, but physics. Not meaning in the human sense, but something like intentionality expressed through material process. When pressure builds in a magma chamber, the mountain swells, its flanks distending measurably, ground deforming in patterns seismologists can detect and interpret. The volcano is saying something is coming, speaking in the language of earthquake swarms and increased gas emissions, telegraphing its intention through changes in the observable world. And when eruption arrives, the message is delivered with precision. This much material, this temperature, this chemical composition, this trajectory and duration, all determined by conditions in chambers and conduits we cannot directly observe, but can only infer from what arrives at the surface. The planet may be speaking to itself more than to us. Volcanic gases alter atmospheric chemistry, which influences climate, which affects weathering rates, which determines how much carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere by chemical reactions with rock, which eventually subducts back into the mantle where it melts and returns to the surface through volcanoes again, completing a cycle that regulates Earth's temperature across timescales of hundreds of millions of years. This is the carbon silicate cycle, a planetary thermostat maintained through volcanic expression, the Earth in conversation with itself about its optimal temperature, adjusting through eruptions and weathering and plate tectonics in a feedback system. So slow it appears static within human lifetimes, but over geological time reveals itself as dynamic equilibrium, a homeostasis maintained through ongoing communication between surface and interior. And somewhere within the silence between eruptions, the planet is listening. Seismic waves from earthquakes travel through the interior, their speeds and paths revealing density variations and phase boundaries, providing information about conditions at depth. Tidal forces from the moon and sun flex the Earth's crust microscopically, generating heat through friction, contributing incrementally to the thermal budget that drives volcanic processes. Cosmic rays penetrate rock, producing isotopes that decay at measurable rates, providing chronometers for dating eruptions and reconstructing volcanic histories. The planet is gathering data about itself, and in some metaphorical sense, using that information to shape its ongoing geological activity. Perhaps we should understand volcanoes not as isolated events, but as moments in a planetary conversation that has been ongoing since the Earth first solidified. Each eruption a word, each volcanic arc a sentence, each period of heightened or diminished activity, a paragraph in a geological text still being written. The planet is telling its story through volcanic rocks scattered across its surface, basalt flows recording magnetic field reversals, ash layers marking extinction boundaries, volcanic glass preserving bubbles of ancient atmosphere, mineral assemblages revealing pressure and temperature conditions at depth. We are learning to read this text, slowly, imperfectly, recognizing that we are simultaneously the readers and part of what is being written about. The language is dense with information if we know how to interpret it. The composition of volcanic rocks tells us about the source regions in the mantle where the magma formed. The presence of certain minerals indicates specific temperature and pressure conditions. The grain size of volcanic deposits reveals how quickly the material cooled, which tells us about eruption style and depositional environment. Every detail is a word in a larger statement about the planet's interior state and evolutionary trajectory. The light holds steady, noon over cooling lava. When stone remembers heat, does it also remember the darkness from which it rose? Does basalt cooling at the surface retain any awareness of the mantle depths where its component minerals last existed as stable forms? Probably not in any way that resembles memory as we experience it. Yet, the rock carries information forward, isotope ratios and crystal structures encoding the conditions of its formation, making the past accessible to present inquiry, allowing geologists to reconstruct eruption sequences and magma sources and tectonic settings from samples collected on weathered mountainsides. The planet preserves its own history in the materials of its expression, every volcanic deposit a footnote in deep time. We stand on a thin crust above an ocean of molten and plastic rock, separated from temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees by mere kilometers of solid stone. It is strange to consider that the ground's stability is temporary, that the mountains are ephemeral, that everything solid is simply moving too slowly for us to perceive its motion. Volcanoes remind us of this impermanence, breaking the illusion of fixedness, showing us that the Earth is still becoming, still finding its form, still negotiating the relationship between its hot interior and cool surface through the punctuated grammar of eruption and repose. Indigenous peoples living near active volcanoes often develop relationships with them that blur the distinction between natural phenomenon and conscious entity. The mountain is addressed, offerings are made, warnings are interpreted from subtle changes in behavior. This is not superstition, but rather a sophisticated form of observation, paying attention to the volcano's moods and patterns over generations of coexistence, recognizing that survival depends on understanding the language of ash clouds and seismic tremors and changes in fumarole activity. The volcano speaks, and those who listen carefully learn to anticipate its words. They notice when steam emissions increase, when animals behave strangely, when water sources change temperature or chemistry. All potential harbingers of coming eruption, all syllables in the volcano's warning vocabulary. Modern monitoring extends this listening into new registers. Seismometers detect earthquake swarms that might precede eruptions. GPS stations measure ground deformation with millimeter precision. Gas sensors sample emissions for changes in sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide ratios. Satellite imagery tracks thermal anomalies and ash plume heights. We have surrounded volcanoes with instruments, created a technological extension of human attention tuned to frequencies and wavelengths we cannot directly perceive, attempting to translate volcanic communication into formats we can understand and act upon. Yet, for all our instrumentation, eruptions still surprise us. The planet speaks on its own schedule, not ours. Time exhales. Over ages, the volcanic conversation has created the conditions for its own interpretation. Without volcanic outgassing, there would be no atmosphere to carry sound waves from eruptions. Without volcanic minerals weathering into soil, there would be no plants to be buried by ash falls and preserved as fossils. Without volcanic activity driving plate tectonics and mountain building and erosion, there would be no complex geology for geologists to study. The planet has, through volcanic processes, generated the context necessary for volcanoes to be understood as something more than random violence, as expressions of ongoing planetary metabolism, as necessary functions in the maintenance of habitability, as the Earth's way of remaining dynamically stable across billions of years. The poets might say the planet is lonely, speaking into the void, hoping for response. But perhaps it is not lonely. Perhaps it is complete unto itself, content with internal conversation. The mantle speaking to the crust, the core heating the mantle, the atmosphere responding to volcanic inputs, the oceans absorbing volcanic gases, the biosphere adapting to volcanic landscapes, everything connected in feedback loops so complex they approximate something, like planetary consciousness, without requiring awareness in any way we would recognize. When Kilauea erupts, lava pours into the ocean with a hiss of steam, creating new land at the rate of acres per day, extending Hawaii's coastline through the simple act of material addition. This is creation in the most literal sense. Rock being born from liquid, solid from fluid, permanence from flow. The volcano is saying, I make worlds, I extend boundaries, I turn interior into exterior, I give form to heat. And the ocean receives this offering, cooling and shattering the lava into black sand that will someday become beach, grinding volcanic glass into particles fine enough to be transported by waves and deposited in layers that will lithify into sedimentary rock that may eventually subduct and melt and return to the surface as volcanic material again. The conversation circles back on itself. No beginning or end, only ongoing exchange. Dusk settles across ancient calderas. We are part of what the earth is saying. Our bodies contain minerals cycled through volcanic processes, water exhaled from ancient eruptions, carbon that has moved through the rock cycle and biosphere countless times. We breathe air whose composition was shaped by billions of years of volcanic outgassing and biological response. We stand on ground built by eruptions, walk through landscapes carved by volcanic deposits. In a sense, we are not separate observers of volcanic communication, but rather syllables within it. Brief arrangements of matter temporarily taking forms that can observe and interpret and assign meaning to the larger processes that produced us. If the planet is speaking through volcanoes, what is it saying? Perhaps something like, I am not finished. I am still active, still transforming, still capable of surprise. I contain energies beyond your control and timescales beyond your planning. I will outlast your civilizations and your species and your entire evolutionary lineage, still erupting when the sun has brightened enough to boil the oceans, still expressing my interior heat until the core finally cools and the whole system falls silent, billions of years from now. Or perhaps it is saying something simpler. I am here. I exist. I move through these cycles because this is what planets do, what self-organizing systems built from stellar debris do, what happens when gravity and radioactive decay and tidal forces interact across geological time. There is no purpose beyond continuation, no meaning beyond process, no message except the ongoing fact of being a planet, alive in the only way planets can be alive, geologically active, transforming, speaking in the language available to mineral and heat and time. The valleys fill with shadow as day recedes. Somewhere a crater lake reflects the dimming sky, its surface perfectly still, holding the image of clouds drifting overhead, like thoughts passing through a mind without disturbing its fundamental calm. The water is warm, heated by magma chambers deep below, mineralized by gases seeping through fractures in the caldera floor. Even in repose, the volcano speaks, not in eruption, but in these subtle emissions, these thermal signatures, these chemical messages released continuously between the dramatic punctuations of explosive activity. The night arrives slowly, gently. In the darkness, magma continues rising through the crust, following pathways established over epochs, responding to pressures building across decades, preparing the next word in a conversation that will continue long after human listeners have vanished. The volcanoes will keep speaking because the planet is still warm, still differentiating, still processing its formation energy and radioactive heat into geological activity. Every eruption is both ordinary physics and small miracle, predictable in mechanism, yet impossible to predict precisely in timing or magnitude or specific consequences. We can choose to hear this as language or simply as process. Perhaps it makes no difference. The planet proceeds according to its own nature, indifferent to interpretation, expressing itself through available means, volcanoes among them. And yet, there is something compelling about imagining volcanic eruptions as speech rather than accident, about understanding the Earth as participant rather than stage, about recognizing in these events a form of agency, even if that agency is purely physical, purely material, purely the behavior of matter following the contours of natural law. The mountain remembers nothing. The mountain only is, moment by moment, responding to conditions, adjusting to forces, erupting when pressure exceeds containment, falling silent when chambers empty and seal. And in that simple being, in that mechanical responsiveness, there exists something we might as well call voice. The planet announcing itself, declaring its presence, participating in the cosmos through the only grammar available to worlds made of stone and metal and heat. Stars emerge above the darkened peaks, their light traveling across distances measured in parsecs and years to illuminate volcanic slopes that will erode and renew and erode again through cycles too numerous to count. The Earth turns beneath these distant suns, carrying its volcanoes through night toward dawn, the whole system rotating, orbiting, drifting through space, while maintaining its internal conversation, speaking to itself in the language of pressure and release, heat and cooling, destruction and creation, unified into a single ongoing statement about what it means to be a living planet. Everything fades toward rest. The glow dims at the crater's edge. Lava cools to black glass that will weather into soil, that will nourish forests, that will someday be buried by the next eruption. The cycle continuing, the conversation proceeding, word after word spoken into the patient dark. And the Earth keeps speaking. We can only listen and wonder